Our very first cadet presenter is Cadet First Class Timothy Goulet. Cadet Goulet is a member of Cadet Squadron 10, and he is going to be presenting on space debris and mega-constellations. Cadet Goulet, welcome.
So, as I was introduced, I am Cadet First Class Tim Goulet, originally from Ellicott City, Maryland. I'm an Astro and Applied Math double major, and I'll be commissioning as a developmental engineer in the Space Force. So with all that, I definitely have a bit more of a technical background, but thankful for the opportunity to present some work here that I was able to do in a class last semester. Okay, so this is the overview. We're going to talk about low Earth orbits and generally the debris problem and the problem posed by these mega constellations. And then 3 different solutions or possible solutions to this problem. So that includes just maintaining what we've already been doing, which I'll get into, expanding international governance through the UN, and another kind of more interesting approach that I'm just going to call security deposits here. Then going to get into recommendations for which one of those I think is best and justification for that. So first, just kind of framing the problem. So low Earth orbit, as I'm sure any of you watching are aware, is generally those orbits with less than 2,000 kilometers altitude, but we're pretty congested at the lower altitudes. So generally you're thinking hundreds of kilometers above the Earth instead of up to that 2,000. So even though it's the smallest, it's also the most crowded. Generally about 80% or so of all the spacecraft in orbit are in LEO. And then also being at that altitude, we see a lot of different flight paths. So you'll have retrograde orbits, obviously mostly prograde orbits, but then this can cause a lot of crisscrossing and risk for collision. Currently, there's about 25,000 spacecraft in LEO, but that number is going to up to quintuple in the coming decades, primarily thanks to mega constellations. So what is a mega constellation? It's not necessarily a defined number of what makes something a mega constellation, but think hundreds up to tens of thousands of spacecraft. So the prime examples for this, we're thinking Starlink, OneWeb. These are all based in LEO, and they're most likely not going to advance beyond LEO because the reason these mega constellations exist is to give us the benefits of sensor coverage in LEO. So we think better ISR imagery, faster communication times, better internet speeds for these companies, but we get the global coverage that we typically expect from a GEO spacecraft. These obviously are going to congest LEO significantly. As I mentioned, the number of spacecraft in LEO could up to quintuple, which is going to make all of the orbital degree mitigation and collision avoidance algorithms we have put to the test. And then another thing that we often don't think about, kind of an unavoidable consequence of this, is micrometeoroid risks. So we're able to track debris and we're able to project those orbits outward to see what's going to happen. But these micrometeoroids are almost random events. So when we put that many spacecraft, especially in the lower altitude orbits, then we have the risk of these random events. Thankfully, in the lower altitude orbits, debris may burn up more quickly, but it's an uncontrollable factor, no matter how good our collision avoidance and other algorithms may be. So options to help mitigate this. First and foremost, just do what we've been doing. So currently, the FCC will approve these mega constellations or not approve them and have them sit in limbo for years at a time. And that's only for US companies, which is a bit problematic when we look at our international partners and what they could be launching too. And then the DoD, soon the Department of Commerce, will monitor that and warn of collisions. And so what are the benefits of this approach? Well, it's simple. We don't have to work with international partners, which makes things a lot easier for implementation. And if we just tell a company, hey, your spacecraft is going to collide with another, there's generally a self-preservation there that's going to make them want to move things out of the way, and that'll benefit the common good. The problem with that is it scalable? We have 25,000 spacecraft in LEO right now. If we up that number by 100,000, are we going to be able to continue doing that effectively, especially if these are at lower altitudes and these collisions may be a little more unpredictable with drag forces or a little more less advanced warning? And it's also the question of who funds the cleanup when these collisions occur. Currently, something happens and we just let it orbit and we dodge it. But as we put more and more spacecraft in there, then we don't want to have some kind of chain reaction where it's going to soon become constant maneuvering just to keep your spacecraft alive. Secondly, expanding international governance through the International Telecommunications Union. So we see a lot of governance from them for geospacecraft, but extending this authority to low Earth orbit. Obviously problematic, but the benefits of this is we define a central authority and they can limit constellation sizes and orbits. They can consider what are those practical limits for putting spacecraft in LEO and how can we sort of, for the common good, have governance over that. And then they could also help take on the space situational awareness mission. The problem that I'm sure many of you are thinking is there's not a lot of oversight of the ITU. So we've seen in recent years, China trying to expand influence in the ITU to get better approvals for geospacecraft. And so if we now put GEO and LEO, arguably the two most important regimes for space under an international umbrella, then we then put a lot of our missions at risk, or else we'll just have to break norms to get our missions done. But the benefit is it's in place for GEO. We could help extend that and hopefully define that central authority. Finally, so kind of a more unique approach is security deposits, as I've labeled them. So what this is really doing is saying, if you're putting a spacecraft in LEO, there is an inherent risk of debris being created, of a collision happening. If we can pre-fund the cleanup or put money aside for monitoring and other efforts, then it's going to be a huge benefit to us in the future if or when these events occur. So obviously there's a few things that need to be worked out with this method. You need some kind of trusted central body to collect these payments and to return them once the spacecraft is deorbited. So it's not necessarily like paying and then the money's gone. Think of it like you go to a hotel room and it's just a security deposit. Once you check out and prove you didn't break anything, the money comes back to you. And this would also force companies to consider how many spacecraft do they truly need? To SpaceX, in their minds, for Starlink, they need these tens of thousands of spacecraft because it's just more convenient and offers more redundancy. But if there's a fee almost being imposed by the danger of adding more spacecraft, is this going to have them consider, okay, do we really need that many? Can we reduce the number, still accomplish our mission, but then reduce the risk associated with it? But obviously the problem, central authority. And this all relies on adherence to norms, which, as we've seen, can work to some extent. It's worked fairly well in GEO through the ITU, but there are limitations once you start telling countries what they can and can't do. So the recommendation I had was for that final one, the security deposits. So the reason is the first two approaches I thought just left too many unanswered questions of scalability, and if they go wrong, how can we recover? So for just leaving things the current course, if we were to do that and it proves non-scalable, then we'll have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of spacecraft in LEO, but no efficient way of helping to stop those collisions once the problem rises. And then the ITU, as we mentioned, vulnerable to foreign influence. We don't want necessarily to give up that control of both LEO and GEO. Obviously beneficial to GEO, we don't want interference, but once we start saying that to low Earth orbit and we start thinking of these other countries, is it really something we want to risk when we have so many academic, civil, and military missions in that regime? And then obviously taking an economic approach, once you start bringing money involved, everyone likes to cooperate. So if we're able to ensure that we have funding there, so then we can help mitigate these or help fund these cleanup efforts, mitigate the debris in the first place, while simultaneously limiting the constellation size, then we'll have the benefits of not as many spacecraft there and a contingency plan for when things go wrong. Unanswered questions, obviously, who is the money going to go to? Are people actually going to follow these norms? Unfortunately, that's just the nature of the space domain of we do need to have these norms that people adhere to, because if you break them, it's not like we're going to shoot rockets or missiles at your spacecraft just to prove a point. So in summary, space debris is a significant problem in low Earth orbit, and it's one that's only going to worsen when we start adding more and more spacecraft to it. The problem could be solved internal to each nation or internationally, but really, once we start involving an economic approach, it just takes a lot of those unanswered questions off the table. And really, it all depends on norms. If people aren't going to follow these norms, then there's not really anything we can do unless we have enforcement mechanisms in other domains or develop a better enforcement mechanism for norms in space. Okay, questions?
I had a quick question, Aubrey Davis from the Department of Laws. As the movement kind of continues to commercialize LEO, and kind of demilitarize it, how do you see that impacting long-term on sort of these regulatory bodies? I mean, I know we're kind of transferring over to the Department of Commerce, but you know, what are your initial thoughts on how that's going to work? Is that going to be a workable system, or do we kind of need to sort of have some military involvement to sort of regulate the traffic? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So great example I've heard is kind of the FAA and, you know, the Air Force. We maintain our own air traffic control towers. We have our own networks for our own aircraft because we need to have those systems in place. But the FAA is able to provide a more general oversight, especially for commercial aircraft. That could be a great extension to space, where obviously we have our own self-preservation at stake for the military. These missions are critical to national security. And so we're going to want to protect those from our own resources, but it'll still be beneficial to have another body out there looking out. So that way, because obviously if a collision occurs, it can affect everyone, but then you take some of that burden off of our already overstrained systems for just military.
Good morning, Alan Schuler, Missile Defense Agency. So you mentioned that the deposits would be returned once these space objects either came down or removed or whatever. What kind of time frame are you looking at on average, or what is the range of time frames you'd be looking at for these funds to be maintained by the central body? Thank you.
Yes. So obviously a lot of questions on execution, primarily what is the central body? We would hope very quickly after, just because we don't want that money held up. The moment you start holding up this money without any cause or justification, it's going to spark a lot of controversy. So ideally, sorry, the spacecraft? So I guess that would depend on the mission life. So currently we're saying, I think it's just switched to 5 years past our mission life. And then this question, what's a mission life? How can I verify that your spacecraft is still in its mission or you retired it? A lot of unanswered questions. And like I said, this is kind of more of a first step that would need more development, because who is that central authority? But ideally, yeah, once the mission is over, deorbit as quickly as possible. And maybe you could levy some kind of financial incentive to that.
So Timothy, we have a virtual question from Mr. Marc Meyer. He asks, at what point would this national registry have to act in a responsible way for the future of space activities, if that makes sense? When would this national regulator have to get involved?
Yes. So that's an unanswered question, because we don't really know what's going to happen once these mega constellations go out. We hear all the time of this collision avoidance technology and how there's no risk of Starlink satellites colliding with other spacecraft, but we've seen instances of that happening. And if you go to, you see this chart up here, I'm sure it's a little difficult to read, but we're seeing exponential growth in the number of close calls between Starlink satellites and other spacecraft. And what is the magic kind of line of when are things going to go terribly wrong? Not sure. And I think it also depends on debris cleanup technology, because if something goes wrong and we can mitigate the problem, obviously it's removed. It's just one of those things of there's no kind of doomsday clock going on. We just know that the problem's growing, and the sooner the better.
All right, thank you so much, Tim. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for that. Our next cadet presenter is going to be Cadet Third Class Thomas Blalock. And Thomas is going to be presenting some research that he and another group of cadets have been doing here at the Academy on the NATO alliance, and specifically the space deterrence framework of NATO. So I'm going to turn it over to Cadet Blalock. Welcome, Thomas.
All right. Thank you, Major Greener. Hello, everyone. As he said, I am Cadet Third Class Thomas Blalock. In 2021, in the fall, Russia performed an anti-satellite test that caused a debris cloud endangering all nation satellites. However, mostly endangering the West, the US, and the NATO alliance because we are so reliant on space. Long story short, NATO Science Technology Organization wanted to develop a framework through wargaming that would deter this type of future aggression. They outsourced research from the Air Force Academy, specifically from a 495 class that Lieutenant Colonel retired Jeffrey Kaz and Dr. Damon Coletta set up with the Social Science Department and the Military Strategic Studies Department here at USAFA last semester. And we got to contribute to this NATO war game to flesh out these concepts. This presentation was adapted from an Academy Assembly presentation that included input from external delegates, other universities, and other military academies, just to give them credit as well. And so this doesn't directly feed into NATO, but it relates to the work that we did with NATO. This is the framework we used to flesh out these concepts and figure out our deterrent suggestions for the Academy Assembly event. The actors obviously being the NATO alliance, its member nations, China, and Russia. And the first thing we established a common baseline for is the space strategic culture. How would our adversaries, or any nation for that matter, respond to actions that we took to deter them in space? These numbers are arbitrary, or these values are arbitrary. The main takeaway from this slide is that we, the West, NATO, are far more reliant on space than our adversaries. If space goes down, our economy will suffer more, our military capabilities will be reduced more, etc. NATO Alliance Space Deterrence. That's a very flashy title, but what are we actually deterring? So here we lay out 4 examples of general categories of what we might be deterring. This is not all encompassing, but this is what we gave to the delegates at the NATO war game in order for them to get a sense of the atmosphere and make their policy decisions. The first being irreversible effects. What we're mainly concerned with irreversible effects is causing a Kessler syndrome, which is when the debris in low Earth orbit becomes too numerous for us to actually launch anything. If you blow up one satellite, the debris will crash into other satellites and it'll cascade until all of low Earth orbit is inaccessible and unusable. The second is loss of human life. Of course, as human intuition suggests, when you lose human life in international politics and also in the law of armed conflict, that is a big deal. And so we really want to deter loss of human life. Some example of this in space. If our space infrastructure goes down, that will affect terrestrial operations so much economically that we will lose significant human life. We also have astronauts in orbit. And so that's another consideration that needs to be taken into account when making these policy decisions. The third is first strike. Because we're so reliant on space, China and Russia will very likely be incentivized to strike our space capabilities preemptively to any other operation, because that would cripple our economy, that would cripple our national power, and that would cripple our military force. And so as soon as these adversaries gain technological advantage over us in space to where they're confident enough to do this, that is a major concern. And then as with international politics, in all domains, we are concerned with a breakdown of communication. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Russia was deploying nuclear forces to Cuba, to them, they thought it meant nothing. But to us, that is politically unacceptable because they're so close. Although technically, they could strike North America from anywhere. And so how do we deter these threats? There are 2 main branches of deterrence that we will be discussing today. The first is deterrence by punishment. That is essentially saying, if you take an action we don't want you to take, we will impose cost on you. We will punish that action. A good example of this is nuclear deterrence. The Soviet Union during the Cold War era was deterred from nuking us because we could send a flurry of nuclear weapons back to them. And so on both sides, we were deterred from that conflict. The next is deterrence by denial of benefit. That is when we communicate to an adversary or an entity, if you take an action we don't want you to take, it's not going to have the desired effect. You will not succeed. One terrestrial example of this would be the Berlin Wall. The communists did not want the citizens of East Berlin to cross over into Free Berlin, so they erected a wall that deterred them from attempting to cross over into West Berlin, deterred some of them. A better example exists in space, which we'll get to later. And so before we develop policy suggestions about developments of deterrence, we should probably examine current deterrence. So what is the world currently doing to deter aggression in space? The first thing we have to consider is that deterrence is an all-encompassing endeavor, all of national power. We can't analyze solely space because nothing in space is isolated, of course. And so what nations tend to gravitate towards is economic sanctions. We saw this in Ukraine. Another example, more related to space, is deterrence by denial of benefit regarding redundancy of capabilities. This chart can help me elaborate on that concept. If we are able to leverage commercial satellite communications, then say we lose one military SATCOM. Those other two do not have a line of sight signal. However, we still have the capability because we can transmit signal over the commercial satellites. And there's another aspect of redundancy I should mention. Suppose we lose one commercial satellite in that constellation. There's so many of them that they still have a line of sight signal. And so, as Elon Musk put it, I can launch more satellites than you can shoot down. Yeah, space norms of behavior and thresholds. So the next type of deterrence is red lines. We want to establish if you cross this boundary, that is an act of war. We are defining that as such. And here we have a few examples of these red lines that we might establish. Of course, these are suggestions to the decision makers. Acceptable exercises in space. So that's testing of non-kinetic effects. That's humanitarian efforts, economic efforts. There are some things we'll have to take by a case-by-case basis, always the case in international politics and law. And then unacceptable activities, things that might cause a Kessler syndrome, things that directly interfere with another nation's operations. And then the fourth, of course, this isn't deterrence, but it's something we should consider and examine, is to foster cooperation and mutual understanding. If China doesn't understand us, if Russia doesn't understand us, any adversary, if we don't understand them, then how will we know what our political actions might do to their decision-making calculus? So the first suggestion, policy suggestion, that the 495 and these external delegates from Academy Assembly came up with is to diversify our dependency in space, reduce our dependency. If we're not as reliant on space as our adversaries, then because space is interconnected, they're not going to be incentivized to cause a Kessler syndrome. They're going to have far more interest, going back to that first slide, than us in space. And so this chart elaborates on that. Some ways of achieving this is, of course, by promoting redundancy, but also promoting alternative technologies to our capabilities. For instance, there is quantum sensing, which might in the future replace part of GPS. Probably not all of it, because it'll be quite a bit more expensive. But the point is, we can use these other technologies to reduce our reliance on space. However, in the near future and even in the distant future, no one foresees that all of space will become irrelevant. That would be preposterous. What do we do then? Actually, first, yeah, the problems are it takes time to develop these technologies. This is not a feasible strategy in the near term. Integration also takes time. Of course, the military lags a little bit behind the commercial sector in how it integrates technology. Everyone's aware of that. And lastly, as I said before, some capabilities can only be achieved through space. And so we can't necessarily rely on alternatives. So our next suggestion, and this is where the current space community is currently trending towards. Diverse, resilient, and redundant constellations. Suppose that an adversary launches an anti-satellite missile against our current satellite infrastructure, large single systems. Those are very prime targets. There's a lot of money in those single systems, and they can get a lot of bang for their buck for aggressing against those. However, if the capabilities for that one satellite is distributed among a constellation, then there's significantly less benefit to them if they blow one up. As in this diagram, we still have so many other satellites. And so that's deterrence by denial of benefit, because they will not achieve their desired effect. They will not cripple our capabilities in any manner. So some problems with this. This doesn't necessarily work against cyber effects. Cyber permeates all of those domains. And so we will need to be cognizant of that in our deterrence strategy. It is also not tenable against the Kessler syndrome. If they're able to reach a critical mass of debris, then of course that would inevitably destroy all of our satellites, no matter how many of them there are, with little cost to them. And as with everything, development takes time. SpaceX is already launching these types of constellations. However, to develop that type of infrastructure for our military would take significant time. And of course, that's not feasible for the near term. So our third suggestion, this is probably our most weird suggestion, is deterrence by interdependence. If we rely on the same capabilities on the same satellites, then they would, of course, not degrade its capabilities because it would hurt them as much as it hurts us. This, of course, requires cooperation and likely is not feasible in the military domain. Yeah, some problems with this is it requires significant cooperation. That's kind of not feasible. Some current examples of this are with scientific endeavors, the International Space Station. And the idea is to expand that into economic endeavors as well. And so here are our policy suggestions culminated into their three main categories. Just to recap, we want to reduce our reliance on space, because if they rely on space more than us, they're not going to risk degrading all of their capabilities because it would hurt our adversaries more. That is a deterrence effect. Next, diverse, resilient, and redundant constellations. They won't attack a satellite if it does nothing for them. Deterrence by denial of benefit. And lastly, deterrence by interdependence. If we unify our capabilities onto a single system, them attacking that system, it would be degrading us. It will also be degrading them significantly. Are there any questions?
All right. Thank you, Cadet Blalock. Thank you, Thomas. Wonderful presentation. Our next presenter is Cadet First Class Marc Previlor. And Marc is going to be presenting on military weaponization of satellites in Earth's orbits. So I'm going to turn the stage over to Marc. Marc, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. On the agenda today, I will characterize the space environment. Then I will talk about some of the current events that have caused some concern in the international community. Then I will address some potential issues with space law and what can we do to strengthen space law to better address some of these issues that we've been seeing in current events and the proliferation of space weapons. And finally, I will end with 4 potential solutions that will help us. So space has been militarized from its inception. However, the rapid weaponization that is currently taking place in the orbits around the Earth bring much concern. The space environment has been described as congested, contested, and competitive. Critical space infrastructure are at risk because of this rapid weaponization, and more needs to be done to ensure the security and safety of this benign environment. So the weaponization that we'll be talking about today is the placement on orbit of space-based devices that have destructive capacity. This involves all anti-satellite weapons, as well, both kinetic and non-kinetic. If more is not done to amend space laws and weapons will continue to proliferate and threaten the future viability of space. I'm just going to the next one. So some current events that I would like to talk about are the development of space, China is developing space arms that they're putting on their satellites. One of them is already fully proven from the SJ-21 satellite, which has the capability to move satellites out of their current trajectory and orbit and change it into a different orbit. And they're developing an even more powerful one for their space station that will be about 10 meters long and have the capacity to move about 20 tons. Up next is Russia. They have built a nesting doll satellite, which has significant military applications. When you think about satellites that can be nested inside other satellites and how a satellite can deploy other satellites to conduct missions, to conduct other operations. And that is very concerning to the international community, just because of the potential military application and weaponization of that capability. And another current event, the final current event that I would like to talk about is the problem with unregistered satellites. For example, the NSS-6 and the NSS-7 satellites were built by Lockheed Martin, but upon their deployment in space, they seem to have disappeared from the international registrar, which is also a violation of space law. So why are we seeing this weaponization in space? So even though all the countries know how harmful it is and the potential escalation of all these weapons, they continue to proliferate in space. So why is that? Well, there is high interest by spacefaring countries to obtain control of the ultimate high ground and to not fall behind the perceived threats of other space nations, as to not put their national security in jeopardy. That's why. If you fail to weaponize, you will fall behind in technological advancements, and countries fear the disadvantage that they would have by not developing their space capabilities, and that is why we're seeing this weaponization. So what are some of the potential issues that we're currently seeing with space law that we can address, that we can strengthen, and so forth? Well, let's start with the Outer Space Treaty. I highlighted just 4 articles from the Outer Space Treaty just to get started in thinking about how to strengthen it. Let's start with Article 4. Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty talks about space weaponization, but it talks about it in the traditional sense, where it only addresses traditional destructive weapons and nuclear weapons. Space technology has evolved far from when the Outer Space Treaty was written, and there's new capabilities, new weapons, new systems already deployed in space that can have just as much, if not more so, terrestrial reach and impact. So those weapons are not addressed, and that's an issue that needs to be addressed. Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty focuses on international liability. Well, what are some issues that we're seeing with international liability? For example, when a Russian spacecraft crashed into Canada, although the article exists for liability to be attributed to Russia to pay Canada for the damages that it caused, we saw Russia not paying Canada what Canada was due for the damages that it incurred. So it doesn't seem to guarantee that states pay full restitution. So oftentimes agreements are reached and contracts are formed, but the party at fault never pays fully. So that's an issue with Article 7. Next, I will address Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which talks about harmful interference. But I don't think there's an article more vague than this article here. What does harmful interference mean, especially in the modern age, where harmful interference can happen from a variety of assets in the space domain? So this article, nations also neglect to undertake appropriate international consultation before launching satellites into space. There's tons of classified operations in space, classified assets in space that are just launched without any consultation from the international community, as outlined here by Article 9. And finally, for the Outer Space Treaty, Article 11, where it talks about the registration of satellites. That doesn't happen, right? As I said just now, satellites are not registered. Covert operations are taking place by all the spacefaring nations. And due to the growing contention in space, it's understandable why nations don't disclose all their assets in space or communicate to that extent. Next, I will address the registration convention. The registration convention kind of goes in line with Article 11, where we need a better enforcement mechanism of the registration convention, because attribution is really hard in space. We all know this. Unless you have extraordinary space domain awareness like the United States, attribution is almost impossible. So that's an issue that's not addressed in this law. Next is the Space Liability Convention, which goes in line with Article 7, which we previously discussed. So paying compensation. There has to be a better way of like doing fault-based in space. Yes. So what are some potential solutions to all these space issues? Well, I outlined 4 potential solutions, because I was thinking about how can we create a space environment that is safer, more stable, and more sustainable. I was trying to think of solutions that would help prevent the escalation of terrestrial conflicts to the space domain. And how do we stop the space arms race that we are currently experiencing? Well, we can start by first increasing the amount of transparency and accountability in the space environment. We can explicitly ban space weapons, space-based anti-satellite weapon systems. As long as there's consensus for what type of weapons we should ban, we should be able to start with that. Countries like Russia, India, China, and the United States, countries that possess advanced space capabilities must enter into bilateral agreements to improve data sharing, communication, and advance notice to decrease negative perception of perceived threats. Maybe China's space arms could be used for space cleaning and not as space weapons. But how would we know if the cooperation is not happening? And finally, my 4th solution is new, more stringent regulatory frameworks and international norms need to be established to better protect the space environment from weaponization. At this time, I would like to open the floor up for any questions that you all may have.
Good morning. My name is Aubrey Davis from the Department of Laws. I really enjoyed your presentation, so thank you very much for your insights here. I'm especially interested in your thoughts on registration. I understand that you have a lot of examples or case studies where people have launched satellites where they haven't been registered. What would you see as the enforcement mechanism to attribute a satellite to a launching state so that we can get within the 67 Outer Space Treaty regime? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. The question was, how can we better do, has to do with how do we better do registration? Well, the current articles in place outline it perfectly. It's just that the international community does not abide by these laws because of the anarchic system of because of the anarchic international system. There's no clear enforcement mechanism to hold states accountable for not abiding by these international laws.
All right, thank you, Cadet Previlor. Wonderful presentation. And let's give one last big round of applause to all of our cadet presenters today. Awesome, thank you.